It's just the room. The room is allowing us to do it. This is a test of the webinar audio. This is just a test to see if the webinar audio is working. Is it working? Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming here today. We have a full room here in person, and we have 50 people registered online. The online camera is over there, so I will wave to the online people. This is our first time doing an event in this hybrid room, so we really appreciate the Union Center's facilities here for having us here today. My name is Molly McCracken, and I'm your host. I'm the Manitoba Director at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is Canada's leading progressive research institute. And I want to thank the Joseph Zukin Memorial Funds, which are housed with the Winnipeg Foundation, allocated to CCPA for research and events, and we're using those for our lunch today. However, if you would like to contribute toward your lunch, there is a donation box over there, and that is also appreciated very much because we rely on our donors and supporters to do the work, local research here in Winnipeg and Manitoba. I acknowledge we are gathered here on Treaty 1 territory and that Manitoba is located on the treaty territories and ancestral lands of the Anishinabeg, Anishinaabeg, the Dakota Ayate, Dene, and Nehiniwak nations, and we acknowledge that Manitoba is also located on the homeland of the Red River Métis. Our topics today is connected directly to action on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and the MMWIG2S Plus calls to justice. Redistribution of resources and funding is needed for truth and reconciliation to become a reality and be enacted. And I know that will be part of our conversations today, but also noting that we wish to hold another event just on that topic of public finance, TRC and MMWIG2S+, because it needs a lot more attention and in-depth consideration with Indigenous people as experts. Tackling today's polycrisis is about the multiple interconnected and compounding crises we're facing: climate change, economic inequality, weakened public services, and health system strain, where the combined impact is greater than the sum of each individual crisis. Global events threaten to degrade social, economic, and environmental well-being and overwhelm current policy responses. But inaction is not an option, and that's what we're here to discuss today locally in Winnipeg and Manitoba. We all know the stakes are very high. I want to acknowledge the incredible and inspiring resistance in our neighbors just south of us in Minnesota and other states in the US. These progressive people are standing up for justice and democracy in the face of authoritarianism. The situation in the US is a wake-up call for Canada. If governments do not work for the working class, resentment grows, fueling the rise of the authoritarian regime. We must modernize and rebuild the welfare state, public services, redistribute wealth from the wealthy to the rest of us, and be involved in and strengthen our democracy. This is important today as the federal government is looking to fund public services in favor of corporate interests. As many of you, I'm sure, noted, just recently, Prime Minister Mark Carney received international praise at the Davos Summit for naming the rupture we are facing, that the rules-based order we are operating within was a fallacy, given that superpowers like the US had a control the whole time. The response from the Canadian government has been neoliberalism in a nicer suit, as John Calvert wrote with CCPA, that Canada is pursuing projects of national interest without due process while slashing public spending and public services. And this is, of course, on top of decades of federal, provincial, and municipal governments not funding public services properly. I also wish to note an op-ed by Robert Chernomus and Fred Wilson in the Winnipeg Free Press today, talking about similar themes and with some very good policy responses there. Given Carney's aversion to tax increases, the increase to 5% public spending in the military budget is likely to be paid for by further reductions in federal transfers to the provinces, exacerbating federal and provincial tensions, particularly in Manitoba, where we rely on these transfers. What are the alternatives? I urge you to look up the CCPA National Elbows Up Summit for an industrial policy and a refocus on building the care economy. And those are some things we're going to talk about here today. We know public services have a very strong multiplier effect that creates good, decent jobs locally. And this is a better way to invest public resources than pipelines and infrastructure to accommodate foreign oil and gas and mining interests. Here in Manitoba, we have a provincial government that was elected to fix healthcare and on an agenda of affordability. While some progress is being made, and we need to note that it is being made, it was on the heels of years of austerity, and a dogged commitment to balancing the budget now is starving the public purse of needed revenue to fix public services and redistribute income to those most affected by the affordability crisis. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're very lucky to have 4 local experts. I'll introduce them when it's their time to speak, to provide an update on provincial action in areas that are so important: climate, poverty, public service, and healthcare. And we're going to start with a presentation first from Jesse Hajer, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So we'll have the presentation, the panel with some questions, and then open up to the floor for questions and discussion. If you're part of the live stream, you can put your questions in the chat there, and Jess or Niall will bring them up to the room. And I also note that this event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. If you know people who couldn't make it today, it will be available probably next week. So to begin, we will hear from Dr. Jesse Hajer, Associate Professor in Economics and Labor Studies at the University of Manitoba. He is a CCPA Manitoba Research Associate, a researcher with the SSHRC-funded Manitoba Research Alliance, and co-editor of Public Service in Tough Times, Working Under Austerity in Manitoba. Thanks so much for presenting today, Jesse.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks everyone for being here today. For several years, we've been doing an event around this time of year in the lead up to the launch of the provincial budget. Organizations, labor organizations, community organizations are often participating in budget consultations. So my presentation today is aimed at helping provide some background context to what is the current situation in Manitoba. Niall's going to throw some slides up there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about what you often hear in the media about the economic context. I'll really briefly recap, what's positive about Manitoba's economic outlook. Spoiler alert, not a lot. And then I'll talk about some of the things that are the dark clouds on the horizon. But what I want to spend most of my time talking about today is how we got here and how we can try to restructure our provincial government fiscal policy to get us to a better place. Okay. No problem. I got them on my phone here, but I'm going to be looking down pretty tight if I don't have them up there. Okay, great. Okay, so just to kick things off, though, I want to talk about why government budgets matter. It's important to remember that budgets are an expression of values of the people who are creating that budget. They're political documents. They're not simply technical documents, and they're not fully determined by external forces. There's a lot of choice that happens by the people who are drafting the budgets. Budgets are distributional. They set out plans for who's going to get what, who's going to pay for what, and when things are going to get paid for. Now, it's important to remember that budgets set out spending plans. Okay, so it's important to also check at the end of the day on what's actually spent. If we look back to the previous conservative government, their budgets were a lot better than what they actually spent, and the budgets weren't great to start with, right? A lot of the cuts that took place under the conservative government didn't materialize necessarily in the budgets, but they materialized in underspending. Okay, so we do have to check, but that doesn't mean that budgets aren't important. Budgets are extremely important, not just for setting out that vision, but also for setting up funds and allocations for the things we want to do. If those in the labor and community movements want to see money spent on things like social housing or workplace health and safety inspector expansions, those things need to be in the budget with the increased budget line to pay for them, or they're highly unlikely to happen. Obviously, there'll be emergency situations like the wildfires where spending will happen. But at the end of the day, we need to get ahead of the game here if we want to see things in the budget and see that money spent. Okay, so let's start with the positive economic signs. One thing that has happened recently is wage growth has been better than inflation. So we've actually seen on average and at the median workers' wages going up in purchasing power terms. That wasn't always the case over the past several years. We see economic growth to get stronger, not in the immediate term, but from 2027 on, the economic forecasters are talking about Manitoba having some decent economic growth and above the Canadian average. We have forecasters pointing to things like the historic 5-year capital plan, the potential for the Port of Churchill development being one of the transformative projects that are undertaken with federal government support, as well as the energy strategy focused on hydro infrastructure renewal. These are all things that forecasters are pointing to that will help support economic growth and in turn generate revenue to spend money on things like public services. Now, the downside, Niall, if you can move to the next slide, thank you. In the short term, we're seeing basically no economic growth. We have real GDP growth slowing since 2022. Manitoba has been underperforming the Canadian economy and in 2024 and is projected to do so in 2025. We have the continuing threats of on-again, off-again tariffs from the United States. This is generating significant economic uncertainty. This is slowing or eliminating economic growth in the Canadian economy. We have the flip-flop by the federal Liberals on immigration, which has significantly constrained numbers, which is holding back labor force growth. We're going to have in Manitoba effectively zero population growth. That's what's projected for 2026 and 2027. And we have the current provincial fiscal situation with historically large deficits, missing the budget projections, high and growing debt load, both comparing this historically and compared to other provinces. Now, budget deficits aren't necessarily bad, particularly if you're investing in the productive capacity of the economy, including people, the workforce, and I'll talk more about that later. But I want to start off by talking about how we ended up here in this situation. And we experienced a significant period of what we talk about as austerity here in Manitoba. Kyle, can you move to the next slide, please? From 2016 to 2020, under the Conservative government, we saw expenditures as a proportion of GDP dropping a full percentage point when it comes to the public sector budget in Manitoba. That was the equivalent of $733 million in spending, 734. And we saw massive tax cuts, taking $1.2 billion out of provincial revenues. And that was just adding up the budget numbers. When you adjust for economic growth, that's grown to over $1.6 billion by 2023. We had massive vacancy rates in the public service, 22% vacancy rate in 2022. We saw civil service wages being frozen, numbers being reduced by 16%, and this meant 2,000 fewer workers just in the public service itself by 2022. And over that time, Manitoba saw its relative economic performance weaken. So economists of my persuasion would not see that as a surprise result, right? Often austerity is promoted as a way of promoting economic competitiveness, but when you look at what actually happens in practice, we actually see economic conditions worsen. And I think that is a warning to our current present context, right? We're in a situation now where the provincial government is wanting to balance a budget, says they don't want to raise taxes, and that doesn't leave us with much options other than another round of austerity. Next slide, please. It's important to keep in mind the context that we have with respect to inequality. But before I do that, I just want to, I'm sure Kyle's going to talk about this as well, but when we look at the impacts of austerity, what did that actually do? It led to compromised public services, including healthcare, education, and other social programs. We saw increased inequities when it came to access to services. And we saw a vicious cycle of understaffing, burnout, attrition, workers being led to despair. We saw reduced value for money. We saw it harder for public servants, for example, to supervise the contractors they were being forced to privatize their work out to. And we saw private contractors taking advantage of that. We saw the reduced capacity of the provincial government to promote Manitoba's collective and social and economic interests. Some of the work that Molly quoted being talked about at the federal level, the federal alternative budget talks about how cuts to the public service has left us particularly vulnerable in this moment of massive economic disruption, right? We have our trading relationship with the US fundamentally being changed, and we have cut our public services to the bone, our capacity to engage in economic planning to the bone, and now we're having challenges pivoting because of that lack of capacity. Okay, so overall, this type of austerity has undermined the ability of government to do important work in a time of crisis. Next slide, please. Now, our provincial context with respect to income inequality, again, no surprise here, an era of austerity led to increased inequality. We did see a reversal under the pandemic, but that was short-lived. The data again shows that income inequality in Manitoba is continuing to worsen. So the top half of the households in Manitoba receive 76% of all the after-tax income based on most recent data. Even more recent data at the Canadian level talks about things getting even worse. So the wealthiest households have done really well recently with the increase in the stock market fueled by many different things, partially policies in the US, redistributing wealth upward and supporting that boom. But what we see is at the other end of the spectrum, things are worse than ever. So we have these highest levels of inequality at the national level than we've ever seen before. And we also see that the responses to this often don't benefit those who are most being impacted by this. So in Manitoba, we saw the responses being primarily tax cuts, right? And the way tax cuts work is the more money you have to spend or the higher income you have, the more you benefit from the tax cuts. And the lower income you have or the lower amount of money you have to spend, you may not benefit at all or benefit only slightly from that. And we've seen this growing inequality with our own eyes, right? We see since the pandemic the growing number of people who are sheltering outside, and that is just becoming a growing challenge for everyone involved. The addictions crisis is only worsening. These are all challenges that can be addressed with government investment that have a strong value for money case for investing in, but we have imposed constraints on ourselves with respect to our budgets that reduce our ability to address these issues. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is that current context that I'm talking about? In the election, many progressive promises around healthcare, but when it came to the fiscal framework announced by the NDP, it was a relatively conservative framework. So there was a commitment to no tax increases to balance the budget in the first term. Not even the Conservatives were saying they were going to do that. And they committed to maintaining the budget 2023 income tax cuts that gave the highest benefit to highest income earners and cost the public purse $500 million. And these tax cuts were not even implemented at the time, but there was a commitment to do. So we saw two sets of commitments that don't necessarily aren't necessarily consistent with each other. So we had this commitment not to raise taxes, not to balance the budget, but at the same time, the NDP said they were going to reverse austerity and reinvest in public services. Next slide, please. So how has that played out? Despite a commitment to balance the budget, that actually has not happened in practice, and it is not moving in that direction. Okay. So on the expenditure front, the provincial NDP government has been consistently increasing expenditures at relatively high rates. So we see growth rates in the 5 to 9% range over the last 3 years. The current forecast, however, sees a significant fall from those higher rates of growth. Now, it's important to remember we saw some high inflation there, right? So inflation reduces the value of money, so those rates aren't as high as you'd think. But when you do this with inflation-adjusted numbers, you still see historically high expenditure growth in the first few years of the NDP government. But we're starting to see that change, perhaps in an attempt to balance the budget. Despite the increase in wildfire costs, we see growth happening at only forecast to be 2.6% growth in the current year. And we still see a very large deficit projected, right? So we see expenditures being scaled back, but we're not addressing that huge deficit. The debt to GDP ratio, which is the measure that economists like to use with respect to the burden of debt on the economy, is continuing to grow. It's one of the top 3 in Canada. So we're in a pretty tight situation in that respect. I would argue one of our own making because of these massive tax cuts, but it is not a great situation to be in. Next slide, please. Great. Now, the NDP has taken some steps to increase revenue, and I think these are important steps. The property tax credit, people may remember years ago, the just outrageous stories about millionaires with these giant, massive mansions getting these huge property tax rebates. The owners of Cadillac Fairview, the owners of Polo Park getting these massive rebates through the change in policy implemented by the PCs. The NDP has reversed that. That's a very important change. They put a cap on the credit. And so now this benefit, once you hit $1,600, you don't get any more. So that's important. That generated $148 million in revenue when it was first introduced. The NDP has also clawed back the basic personal amount. So high income earners start to lose this credit. That generated $14 million. In the last budget, they de-indexed tax brackets, which again is, it seems like a little technicality, but will generate $82 million a year. So these are important steps to help undo the reduction in capacity for governments to invest here in Manitoba, but it's only making up about 14% of the tax revenue that was cut by the PC government from 2016 to 2023. So still a challenging situation, and I would argue that this is a big part of the challenge we face with these very large deficits, despite expenditures going down. There was an article today on CBC that, again, people talking about the current Manitoba situation as a structural deficit, which means this isn't a cyclical thing because the economy is doing badly. This string of consecutive large deficits, it just means that we just don't have enough revenue built into our system to balance a budget. Great. So if you look at the data here, part of the story is that we've been not as bad as it could be because federal transfers have been more robust than they have been historically. But if you look at the amount of revenue that Manitoba is taking out of the economy to spend on public services, it's at record lows, right? We're down below 16% again, which is again a record low. Now, some of that has to do with hydro revenue shortfalls, but a big part of this also has to do with the tax cuts. Okay, so to wrap up, so we have Manitoba still in a structural deficit due to the tax cuts of the PCs and these tax cuts maintained by the NDP, with some progress in clawing some of that back. This is being exacerbated by the current economic slowdown. Balancing the budget as planned and also committing to not raising revenues is going to require cuts to public services. There's no doubt about that. So we are certainly in a tight spot if things continue as they're described to do. We have public services recovering, but still not recovered from the deep cuts by the PCs. A lot of the spending that we've seen has really just backfilled from the wage freeze, right? A lot of this spending that's gone on was because the government, rightly so, negotiated better agreements or some agreements that just weren't negotiated at all for many years with labor unions in Manitoba, and workers saw some increases there, but really they're just catching up for what they lost under the PCs. So if we do go ahead on this course, it risks further negative economic outcomes, right? The negative outcomes associated with government cutting back spending in the middle of an economic downturn is only going to worsen that economic downturn. Okay. You can just click it all now. Sorry, I didn't. Okay. So I would argue it's imperative to look in the medium planning horizon of the government at additional revenue measures. You could try to keep running deficits like this, but as I showed in my data before, the data is not really supporting us being in a good place to do that in perpetuity. And we're also at a situation, which we're going to hear from our panelists today, that structural investments are needed to rebuild the public service. We need to invest in things like quality childcare. We're incredibly behind on our commitments to build new childcare spaces. Social housing, despite the progress being made, is still only scraping the surface of the problem. Climate change mitigation, energy efficiency, infrastructure investments. These are all things that have high economic and social returns. They require a well-resourced public service to manage this and implement. And it's especially important for us to be making these investments in a time when the economy is faltering. One final point, we saw the Carney government implement a GST credit expansion. If the provincial government is going to go ahead and try to do something to support affordability, I think we need to make it send a loud and clear message that this should not be done through tax cuts. We know the money doesn't go where it's needed most. The type of things that the federal government have done where these investments are targeted is what I would suggest is the way to go if you're going to do that. But there are many worthy projects that are requiring public funds right now, so no shortage of options. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jesse. So much to chew on there. And yes, February 10th, there is a Manitoba budget consultation. They do it every spring. So you can take this information and go participate there as well. So we're just going to move ahead with our panel, and we have two questions. So they have about 2 to 3 minutes each. So we're very fortunate to have Laura Cameron, who's the director of the Climate Action Team. And her first question is, as a smaller province in a medium-sized country, why is leadership and action on climate by the Manitoba government so important?
Thanks, Molly. Is this on? Is it on? Hello? Can you hear me? I have to, okay. Can I hold it? Okay. I don't have to talk like this all the time. Well, thanks very much for the invitation and to the CCPA for organizing. yeah, I think, why is it important for Manitoba to act on climate, even in the midst of, the story that we just heard, which was pretty dark? Um, there's a few reasons. Obviously, it's easy as a small province to feel like Manitoba's emissions are not important, and also to get increasingly despondent, I think, as many of us feel, looking at the US retrenchment of fossil fuel interests and backsliding on climate policy in a number of jurisdictions. But I think there's also reasons that many of us are familiar with for why it's still important for Manitoba to pursue climate action and investments. We have a very high per capita emissions in Manitoba, second only to Alberta and Saskatchewan. Not only that, but in Manitoba and Canada, we have very high historic contribution to emissions. So in order to do our fair share in the global fight against climate change, we actually should be reducing our emissions faster than what the Paris Agreement global targets are, and supporting and financing the transition in other countries. And I think on the other hand, on the more optimistic side, I guess, I think that Manitoba can actually pioneer and lead in climate solutions in certain areas. For example, around like innovating cold weather solutions through a robust retrofit industry and energy efficiency and battery storage. That's something that we've been advocating a lot for at the Climate Action Team. Building battery systems at grid scale for cold weather climates that can also spur, proof of concept and spur action in other jurisdictions. So that's maybe a more optimistic look. I think on the flip side, if we do the opposite, if we continue to sort of delay on climate action or expand fossil fuel infrastructure, that also enables the same in other jurisdictions. It's obviously climate change is a global fight, and Manitoba's reductions are relatively small in the broader scheme. But I think, if we continue to, for instance, advocate for a pipeline to ship fossil fuels out of Churchill, that would have devastating impacts that would extend far beyond our borders. So what happens here in Manitoba on climate and the energy transition is really important. And I think, as sort of Jesse laid the groundwork for, there are also many social and economic opportunities and benefits that come from climate investments if they're done in the right way. So a few of those that I would highlight are building retrofits, as I mentioned. So I was part of a report with the ISD and the CCPA a few years ago called Manitoba Builds Green, where we looked into the sort of economic opportunity and benefits that would come from really scaling up in a serious way investments in retrofits to increase energy efficiency in commercial, institutional, and residential buildings in Manitoba, and the job creation potential that those investments would have. Investing in public and active transit is another one to reduce car dependency while also reducing household bills related to transportation, and having health co-benefits related to physical activity, reducing air pollution, and so on. And yeah, I think, that these solutions do need to be targeted so that they lessen inequality. For example, prioritizing funding for transit and active transit over EV rebates, because we know that EV rebates on their own disproportionately benefit wealthier Manitobans who have the means to purchase an EV. Do I have one more minute to make one last point? Am I over my time? Okay. I guess I would just underscore also that, the longer we delay emissions reductions globally, including here in Manitoba, the more costly climate impacts are going to be. And, we saw that in the fall economic update from Adrian Sala, Minister Sala. The first words out of his mouth were climate impacts, basically, because the drought causing losses for hydro, as well as the wildfires of last year, have hugely impacted the deficit, and those impacts are only escalating as long as we delay climate action. And I would say that, current provincial investments on climate fall far short of the scale that we need to be at, but maybe I can return to that later.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Next, we have Hafiz Jatto, who's a community animator with the Social Plan Council of Winnipeg. and involved with the Campaign 2000 report. So, can you share some of the drivers of growing income inequality and rising poverty in our communities? And your thoughts on the recently released provincial poverty reduction strategy? Will it have an impact?
For sure. Thank you, Molly. I think everyone can hear me. It's an honor to be on this panel with so many smart local experts. Jesse actually used to be my professor in the labor studies department, so it's not Dr. Hajer today. Okay. Yeah, so at the Social Planning Council, we work closely with direct service providers and local coalitions who support our most underserved community members. So through those connections, we hear from frontline folks, and they're painting a concerning picture. The drivers of growing inequality are multifaceted but interconnected. And I appreciate the framing of a polycrisis because when you imagine folks with intersecting identities, they're being affected by this crisis in multiple ways, whether it be from the impacts of the climate, um, but primarily one thing that we see being often politicized but is really affecting people is cost of living pressures, right? So like according to our partners at Harvest Manitoba, who we work with on the Campaign 2000 report, we're seeing a 29% increase in food bank usage, and 50% of the folks who use food banks are going hungry at least once a month because they can't afford food. The Christmas Chair Board recently became involved in the Campaign 2000 report as well because of the demographics they often serve, and they're often seeing that there's change in that. They're now seeing more single people having to get supports through the chair board, right? So systemic racism remains a fundamental driver, with poverty disproportionately affecting our racialized community members, whether that be Indigenous community members or folks who are racialized in other ways other than white. So it's not just abstract, but embedded in our systems through discriminatory enforcement laws as well. It's really sad to read almost 2 years ago now, Tammy Bateman was killed while Winnipeg police were driving through Riverside Park, right? Knowing that there was an encampment there, which kind of exemplifies how systems can be deadly, right? And this is again is the effect of housing instability, which drives inequality, leading to more encampments. Like Jesse said, this cost of living, it's visible. People are in situations they need to be in. People are accessing food banks because they need to. Families are making hard decisions at the grocery stores as to what food they have to leave off every time they go, right? In 2023, just a little bit over the place, Voices Manitoba Youth and Care Network collaborated with Youth Employment Services on a report looking at the experiences of youth transitioning out of care, right? And what they found is that the system is not meeting its own policies, right, from the kids who are experiencing this. 50% as well of the respondents to the last street census indicated that they had spent time in foster care, and 92% of those were Indigenous. So through the work we do supporting coalitions, what we hear often is that there's a pipeline for youth who are experiencing poverty, apprehended, most often Indigenous, in care, and transition from being in care onto EIA, being in the justice system, right, or being unhoused. Sometimes a combination of both of those things. So regarding the provincial poverty reduction strategy, not to paint such a dire picture, current strategies at the both municipal and provincial level sort of remain vague and chronically underfunded. Like I talked about, youth in care are a vulnerable cohort, and it is heartening to see that they're identified as a priority group in the poverty reduction plan. But we need clear timelines and tangible targets. All right. So in my next question, I'm going to go into more recommendations from the Campaign 2000 piece. But yeah, it's really hard out there. Like Jesse has just sort of highlighted, systems are chronically underfunded, and when we have that, even if human beings have the most well-meaning intentions, they're doing the best at their jobs, there's not enough people to meet the need we see in our communities. Unfortunately, in the news again, we're seeing more people dying in ERs before they're seen or seen properly, right? So the systems are inherently racist, stressed, and so the people who are going to be more affected are racialized people, right? So that's what I answered now. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Hafiz. Next up, we have Kyle Ross, who's the president of the Manitoba Government and General's Employees Union, to talk about the effects on the civil service. Kyle, can you share with us the challenges MGU members working in Manitoba's civil service are facing? What are workers experiencing? How is this impacting public services?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me up here. Our workers are really in the civil servants. Many are working 2 and 3 jobs in their offices. The previous government didn't fill any positions when people left, retired. So there was just indiscriminate left jobs open. So the people in those offices picked up that work and did that work. And because they care about Manitoba and they care about the service they provide. And when we talk to our workers, they're really frustrated that they can't provide the quality of service they'd like to provide, that they believe in, because they just have to run to the next problem, to the next problem, to the next problem. And we're continuing to see low staffing levels. We have a high vacancy rate, almost 20% in the civil service. So it's still happening. It's getting better, but it's still happening. Just last summer, I would say at the beginning of the fire season, we had 60 wildland firefighter positions budgeted for that weren't filled. And when you talk to those workers, many of them said like, we probably could have got ahead of some of these fires had we had the people to do that work. And they just weren't hired. And they were so frustrated because like we saw what happened in Lac du Bonnet and the fires getting away in the north. They said if we could have been on them sooner, had enough people, we would have been able to stop that damage to the province. And so it's tough for them, and we see it all over the place. Of course, my phone went to sleep. We just seen it recently with the court staff. Just up here for traffic court, they're closing 1 day a week now, or closing early, because they just don't have enough people to do that work. It's the photo radar is out there. The same amount of tickets are coming in all the time, but they don't have the people to process that work. They're always fighting from behind and trying to keep up. So it's really frustrating for civil servants in Manitoba right now. They're doing the best they can with what they have, and they're trying to ensure that Manitoba can strive, but they're just not enough of them, and we continue to see it. So we're hopeful this government will make a change and put a little more priority on hiring, but right now we're not seeing it. So civil servants are fighting from behind, I would say, for the most part, and doing the best they can. It's tough for them.
Thank you so much, Kyle. And we have Noah Schultz, who's the provincial director of the Manitoba Health Coalition. Noah's question, recent headlines indicate progress in recruiting healthcare staff in Manitoba, yet the province of Manitoba continues to have long ER and wait times for many services. Is the healthcare system recovering from the years of austerity under the previous government?
Is this close enough? Can people hear me? I'm going to keep mask on if possible. And just as with my fellow panelists, I want to thank you, Molly, and CCPA for the opportunity. Proud to have two of MHC's board members next to me on this panel. Little plug for our organization there. But I'm going to immediately steal Jesse's excellent line. The system is recovering, but it's not recovered, I think is a good way to think about healthcare. I also think to what one of the things Hafiz said, and we've been seeing these stories of ER or, people waiting in the ER with not being seen quickly enough and going home, passing away. We have multiple critical incidents in the news right now. Sorry, I want to get these people's names right and remember the details. The loss of Judy Burns and Stacey Ross, those kinds of stories, or what healthcare workers are experiencing. That reality and the spending isn't connecting as well as it could. We are seeing investment. We are seeing hundreds of healthcare workers hired. But the PCs dug such a deep hole in healthcare spending that we are well from above surface. We're not, out of that hole yet whatsoever. And that's why, even though the investment is welcome, it really needs to increase and expand to actually rebuild the system. We're keeping it alive, afloat, and partly that's because of increased health transfers and federal support. But if we want to truly rebuild our healthcare system so it can live the principles of the Canada Health Act to have universal and accessible public care for all of us, investment needs to increase. We need to have direct investment in staffing. That's started, but like others have said, it's really just getting us kind of where we should have been years ago to reach the kind of healthcare spending we saw before the PCs in the 2016s. A lot more money is going to need to be invested. And thank you, Niall, like others on the panel, the Health Coalition does not want to see investment in healthcare, in the social safety net, sacrificed for short-term economic budget balancing. These are investments in the health and well-being of our province. We need healthy people to work and grow the economy in Manitoba. And for us as a health coalition, we want to see public solutions, not private for-profit healthcare filling the gaps. And so I will say, yes, the investment is going to be making a difference. I shudder to think how much worse off healthcare would be if we had had yet more years of cuts immediately following the last PC term. If we hadn't had the investments we had in healthcare in the last two budgets, things would be worse. But that's not a big comfort to folks if you've lost a family member and are not sure if the healthcare system is going to be there for you when you need it. And it's similar for workers who face those cycles of attrition and burnout and all this caused by ongoing understaffing. So I'm going to try to end it there, keep it brief if I have even had a chance of that. But yeah, I think it's helpful as Jesse says, recovering but not recovered, and that recovery will flatline if funding does not continue to increase to transform us out of the ongoing crisis we're in.
Thank you so much, Noah. So the next round of questions is more optimistic and forward-looking. I ask you, I think we perhaps we're too ambitious with our time frame here. So if you're able to keep your answers quite brief, and if anybody has any questions, they can, of course, approach people, because I do want to take a couple questions before we close. But Laura, there was 29 civil society groups at the legislature last week. Can you highlight some of what these groups are asking Manitoba to do in this provincial budget?
Sure, yeah. So last week we organized a press conference and submitted a joint letter with, as Molly said, a wide range of groups from environmental, labor, health, and other community organizations signed on to advance, sort of to support investments in climate in the spring budget. And so it was quite exciting to have that kind of alignment. We'll see if it has any impact on this sort of balanced budget approach that the government has committed to. But as I mentioned previously, the current committed funding under this current government for climate action is around 72 million, according to our total calculations, as compared to 314 million roughly for the gas tax holiday, and 1.2 billion that's been spent on roads and highway construction in the last 2 years. Not to mention the $3 billion proposed gas peaker plant from Manitoba Hydro. So our climate action spending is just not where it needs to be. And so we put forward a handful of recommendations. I would highlight three in particular that we would love to see in this budget. The first is around public transit operating funding, so reinstating the 50-50 or something similar matching funding for municipalities that was cut under the previous government. The second one is around doubling the budget of Efficiency Manitoba, so about 100 million more invested in that to ramp up energy efficiency and retrofit programs. And the third being to work with Manitoba Hydro to invest in grid scale battery energy storage to hopefully delay or see the need for that gas peaker plant eroded over time by pairing batteries with energy storage. We also have other recommendations related to tackling big industrial polluters, reducing landfill emissions via composting and waste diversion, and agriculture, but I'll just leave that there. We do have a whole report on it. I'm happy to share if anyone wants more info.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we're really lucky to have the climate action team on all these issues here. Hafiz, can you talk a little bit about the recommendations from Campaign 2000 and the Child Poverty Report? Can you give us a sneak peek?
For sure. Thank you, Molly. Yeah. First thing I'll say, the child poverty data for Manitoba should alarm everyone. Based on Stats Canada 22 data, Manitoba child poverty rate is 27.1%. So that's much higher than the national average of 18.1%. And in communities like Winnipeg Centre, it's up to 41% of youth living in poverty. Right? So, I'm sorry, Molly, you said more hopeful. I just wanted to give that context for folks, right? So, based on that, Campaign 2000, again, for the last 35 years, keeps asking for intentional prioritizing of these vulnerable youth, starting with early years programming. And like I had referenced earlier, these systems are inherently racist. The legacy of colonialism, slavery, and racism is not so far past history for us. You know, February is Black History Month, and we're learning about living icons still who had to do work in their lifetimes to create more equitable systems that we all benefit from today. When we lift the lowest of us, okay, I'll get off the soapbox. You said 1 minute, sorry. But for real, creating comprehensive supports for early years, and just on that point, 91% of apprehensions by CFS are of Indigenous youth. So instead, let's focus on supporting these vulnerable families. with comprehensive supports, with a living wage benefit. Also, for another vulnerable cohort is youth transitioning out of care. Like I had mentioned from the Youth Employment Services and Futures Forward report, CFS, based on the experiences of youth in care, is not living up to its own policies. So intentional support of that period leading up to transition, like every parent, most parents do for their kids, and every parent would wish to be able to do for their kids to prepare them for transitioning successfully at 18. So that's a cohort that could even benefit from a study on a living wage, right? Already there's a need for that. And then lastly, just I want us to adopt long-term investment thinking over short-term budget balancing. So Social Planning Council will be supporting a budget recommendation and echoing the same call that CCPA is, that we need sustainable poverty reduction through consistent multi-year funding. Some last just tangible kind of like policy recommendations I could leave with is a bold target of a 50% reduction in child family poverty. That could be a target of the new poverty reduction plan, and a measure that we could use is the Canadian Family Low Income Measure after tax threshold, just establishing that as a baseline. Indexing the healthy baby prenatal benefit to inflation. So this benefit was introduced in 2001, and it's had given up to about $81 a month for low income folks earning less than 32,000 a year. And it was recently doubled by the NDP government to $160, but still that's not enough for this cohort. So we need to index that to inflation. Programs like the Canada-Manitoba Housing Benefit, which is now ended because there's just not a budget for it, had such a high uptake because there is the need for that. So indexing the rent assist as well to inflation so that that could be a comprehensive, robust program that meets the need and demand that exists in community are just some recommendations that might be included in the Campaign 2000 report. So the launch is on February 25th, and more information will be shared through our channel, Social Planning Council. Thanks again for having me, Molly.
So much. Lots to chew on there. Kyle Ross, briefly, what is needed to rebuild the public service and the civil service? What steps is MGU looking for with this Manitoba government?
We're optimistic, I'll say, that we're going in the right direction, but the government needs to make it a priority that they want to see these services filled and functioning in a proper way. We've heard that from them, but we're not seeing it. We're not seeing the hiring. We often see when we, even with our posts on Facebook, we talk about filling the jobs, and we always have comments on there. Well, I've applied. All these people have applied, but they don't get a call back, or they haven't. And we hear often it takes way too long to hire. So we have to. The government would need to focus and make it a priority to fill these jobs. And I don't know if that's their focus. And really, we have to wonder, like, the future of the service is in trouble, I think, because we have a lot of high functioning staff that have been there a long time. When they leave, that knowledge leaves with them. And if you don't have someone there working and learning from them, they're starting from scratch. So then that job that was done by one person now may take two or three. Like, we have those risks are there with the civil service, and we have to be conscious of them, and we have to do work to retain those workers we have. It's upon us to bargain a deal that does that, and we're ready to do that work coming up. But retention has to be a priority as well, because the risks, and the big risk is privatization. We've seen it. The snowplow operators up until now, they're still short staffed, but before the government changed, they were really short staffed, and the service was starting to struggle and fall apart. And then the privatization voices started coming out. Well, if it's privatized, it'd be better. No, it's more expensive. It doesn't put our dollars to better use, and a lot of times those dollars leave Manitoba. So there's work to be done. Currently, right now, I'll talk to DTS in the government. It's Digital Transformation Service, I think. It's the IT folks, and I'm an IT guy by trade before this. So they have a 35% vacancy rate right now in the provincial government. In an age of IT, in an age of data, an age of information. So what kind of decisions is our government making, and what information are they getting to make those decisions when their IT group is not there? And if they're privatizing that or putting it out to contract, those dollars are leaving Manitoba. They're leaving to the South US, they're leaving to Ontario, they're leaving out west. To me, I believe those dollars need to stay at home and reinvest in our economy and reinvest in Manitobans. So there's opportunities for this government to do well for us. It's going to take time, and hopefully they make it a priority. So thank you.
On that vein of privatization, we've been watching with great concern about what's happening in Alberta in terms of privatization of healthcare. And the Manitoba government here has spoken out against privatization, but is continuing to rely on private agency nurses. And you wrote an op-ed on this recently, Noah. Can you speak to that change of course here in Manitoba and what's happening, what's needed?
Well, I'll do my best, Molly, and I'll try to keep it brief. I mean, there is the big picture of privatization around our country, and those pressures in healthcare and what we see in places like Alberta should outrage and frighten all of us, as they certainly do around health advocate tables. And we have to remember that Manitoba is not immune to that. We are lucky and have opportunity with this government to actually work with a government that says they defend public health care, that says they support the Canada Health Act, to have comprehensive, accessible, and universal health care. But the Health Act still leaves room for private delivery of care. And so that's how Manitoba can be well within compliance with the Canada Health Act, one of the best in the country by the last report. And we can still have heavy and costly reliance on agency staffing. We can have a new 5-year deal with the American owned private for profit lab company, Dynacare. And as Kyle notes, this does not save the public money, but this pattern happens again and again. We see austerity and understaffing or underfunding causing attrition, understaffing, burnout, problems in the system. It cannot sustain the services it needs to in rural and remote communities, especially. And then solutions from the profit driven private sector fill the gaps, but especially with healthcare, those are still public dollars going to support that, as we see with agency nursing, paramedics, healthcare aides, home care workers. There's a lot of stealth privatization through agency staffing in Manitoba. And what would it take to fix it, which I know is the heart of the question? I think the biggest thing is political will. We need the investment in the public system, and we need the public education that roles like mine fill to show people that privatization does not give us more choice. It doesn't cut those wait times down. It actually worsens the capacity of the public system and the system overall, because you're just redistributing healthcare workers into the private system. And we see that's happened in places like nursing. So we have to untangle that dependence on privatization and on agency staffing by investing in public solutions like the provincial travel nurses team that can have legs if it's properly invested in, properly planned. And it can apply to other areas beyond nursing. So we need those kinds of solutions to actually have the investment. We need the government to stand up to private insurance, to invest in the public system as opposed to spending more in private. And especially, we cannot let the untangling of privatization and agency use harm communities in rural Manitoba and northern Manitoba who have become dependent on those agencies through no fault of their own, through government disinvestment and neglect. So political will, pressure from below, Manitobans who are educated about the harms of privatization, pushing their government, holding them accountable to deliver on a truly public and universal system. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild that and to improve how it treats all Manitobans, that public system, but we will never get there with more privatization.
Okay, we've had a whirlwind here. Thank you so much to our panelists for such a detailed conversation, but also really sharing so much knowledge and experience with us in a condensed format. I think I have time for a question. Is there a question from the audience? Oh yeah, go ahead.
What do we do when the government ignores all these pleas?
The question is, what do we do when the government ignores all these pleas? What do we do when the action is not? We don't see the action taking place. Does anybody want to go for it?
I say we get loud. That's your answer. Is you have to get out and make them aware that this is a problem. It's you can't solve a problem they don't know about. We're a union, right? We can't help our members if they don't come to us and tell us what the problem is. So, my opinion is, if the government's not listening, you got to get their attention. They can't pretend once you tell them, though.
Okay. Thanks, Kyle. Do we have one question from the internet?
Jesse talk about the economics of investing in addressing root causes as well as prevention and also early intervention compared with investing in putting out fires.
Questions about upstream investments versus downstream?
Yeah, there's a lot of great work that's been done on doing cost benefit analysis on interventions, and there are areas where there is just no doubt about it. Early childcare interventions are one that's, across the political spectrum, it is shown that when you put money into helping, especially youth in vulnerable situations, young kids, into quality childcare, you get your money back and more. And you can look at other areas of social spending, like homelessness, investments in preventative health. These are things that in the long run, particularly when you have a public healthcare system, you make money on these investments, more than you would get putting it in the stock market even. So it is important to continuously remind governments that when you choose not to invest, there's a cost. There's a cost to doing nothing, and that cost is borne by the government eventually. This comes through loud and clear when you talk to public servants. It comes through loud and clear when you do randomized control trial studies. The evidence is strong. We just need, again, the political will to invest.
Well, that's a great spot to end it. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Thanks everybody online. We have Jesse Hajer from the University of Manitoba, Laura Cameron from the Manitoba Climate Action Team, Hafiz Jato from Social Planning Council and Campaign 2000, Noah Schultz from the Manitoba Health Coalition, and Kyle Ross from the Manitoba Government Employees Union. Please look into these groups and sign up to our email list here, and show up on February 10th. Thanks, everybody.